Episode: The Money Machine, How Britain Built an Empire Without Fighting. In 1776, America declared independence. This was not supposed to happen. A colonial administrator in London, reading the declaration in the Morning Post, would have done the calculation immediately. America was a 3-month sail away. America had a population of 4 million. British forces could not reinforce quickly, could not project power indefinitely across an ocean. By every measure of military capacity, Britain should have lost this war. And yet, Britain won. Not decisively at first, but completely, ultimately, by 1783. Now here is the question that historians spend careers avoiding. Not, how did Britain win? The question is, why did winning matter so little? Because here is what happened after. After the Treaty of Paris, after Britain formally recognized American independence, after the guns went silent and the empire supposedly shrank, British influence in America did not decrease. It exploded. Within 30 years, America was consuming British manufactured goods at rates that made the lost colonial tax revenue look like pocket change. American cotton, harvested by enslaved people in the American South, was flowing to British textile mills faster than the mills could process it. American grain was feeding British workers. American capital was flowing into British banks. By 1820, less than 40 years after losing a war, Britain had greater economic control over America than it ever did when America was a colony. Think about that. Britain lost the military conflict, and in losing, it won something far more valuable. This is not a story about military genius. This is a story about something else entirely. This is a story about what happens when you realize that soldiers and ships are actually the second best tool for building an empire. That the best tool is something far quieter. Something that moves through ledgers and contracts and the slow, patient construction of financial obligation. This is the story of how Britain built the largest empire in human history. Not by conquering, but by making everyone want to trade with them so badly that they would pay whatever price Britain set. And once they had paid it, once they were dependent on that trade, conquest became almost unnecessary. They had already surrendered. They just did not know it yet. Chapter 1: The Merchant and the Crown. London. A year that does not appear in most history textbooks. A year that changed everything. Not because of a war. Because of a loan. William III, Dutch prince, Protestant, installed on the English throne to prevent Catholic succession, needed money. Desperately. The crown was bankrupt. Wars against France had bled the treasury. The old method, taxing subjects and hoping they did not revolt, was not going to work. William needed capital. So he did something radical. He approached a merchant named William Paterson. And together they invented something that had never existed before in the history of finance. Not a bank. Banks existed already. This was different. They created the Bank of England. Not owned by the Crown. Not a government institution. A private corporation chartered by the Crown designed to loan money to the Crown at rates the bank determined, with the bank's own bankers making decisions about repayment and interest. In return, the bank received a monopoly on paper currency. It could literally print money. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Because in order for the bank to print money, and have that money actually mean something, to have people accept it as payment instead of demanding gold or silver, the bank had to prove that the money was backed by something real. Something tangible. Something that could not disappear. And so William Paterson did something brilliant. He designed the bank's reserves to be backed not by gold stored in vaults, but by the Crown's future ability to collect taxes. Tax revenue was a promise. A future stream of income. Something the Crown would collect eventually. And if you could turn that future promise into present capital, if you could borrow against next year's taxes to spend today, you had unlocked something extraordinary. You had turned time into money. This is the moment. This is the founding instant of modern capitalism. Not the moment someone invented money. That is ancient. Not the moment someone invented banking. That is medieval. This is the moment when someone realized that you could securitize, turn into tradable instruments, the future tax revenue of an entire nation. Investors bought shares in the Bank of England. Those shares could be bought and sold. The value of a share was determined by how confident people were that the English Crown would continue to collect taxes in perpetuity. Which meant how confident people were that England would continue to exist and remain dominant. Which meant the stronger England's military and political position, the higher the bank's shares. Which meant wars were not expenses to be avoided. Wars were investments. A successful war meant more territory. More territory meant more tax revenue. More tax revenue meant the bank's assets were more valuable. Which meant share prices went up. Which meant the investors who had backed the war made enormous profits. Cui bono? Who benefits? Now, in 1688, this was a closed loop. The king borrowed from the bank. The bank's investors made money if the king won wars. So the investors had financial incentive to push for war. This existed in other monarchies too. France, Spain, the Netherlands, they all borrowed from merchants. But they borrowed on an ad hoc basis. When they needed money, they went begging. England, through Paterson's invention, created a permanent, systematic relationship. A machine that continuously converted future tax revenue into present capital. A money machine. And once you have a money machine, you can do things no other nation can do. You can fight longer wars, because you can borrow more. You can maintain larger armies, because you have more capital to pay them. You can build more ships. You can conduct sustained military campaigns while your enemies are still scraping together funding for the next season's campaign. This is why Britain, a relatively small island, began to dominate global warfare in the 18th century. Not because British generals were smarter, but because Britain could afford to be at war continuously. While other nations had to make peace to recover, Britain could keep fighting. The machine kept printing money. The machine kept paying soldiers. The machine kept building ships. But here is the thing that Paterson understood: and that most historians still miss. A money machine is only useful if you have something to buy with the money. If you print currency and nobody wants it, you have paper. So the Bank of England had to solve one more problem. It had to make sure that British money, Bank of England notes, were accepted globally as if they were gold. And to do that, it had to make sure that British goods, British manufactured products, British financial services, British ships were so valuable and so necessary that every nation on earth had to hold British money in order to buy those goods. In other words, it had to create a global market that depended on Britain. And that required a different kind of strategy entirely. Now, the East India Company had existed since 1600. It was chartered by Queen Elizabeth I to conduct trade with Asia. For over a century, it was a merchant operation. Buy spices in India. Sell them in Europe. Profit. But by the 1680s, the same moment William Paterson was inventing the Bank of England, something changed. The company began to acquire territory. Not as a merchant buying land for warehouses, but as a governing authority. The company started to conquer, to build forts, establish garrisons, collect taxes from local populations, make laws, enforce them with military force. In essence, the company became a state with shareholders. And here is where the brilliance of this system becomes clear. The Crown did not have to fund military conquest of India. The Crown chartered a company to do it. The company's shareholders funded the conquest because they expected the conquest would increase their profits. The company's investors bought shares. The value of shares depended on how much territory the company controlled. How much territory the company controlled depended on how aggressively it conquered. So the system created a permanent financial incentive for expansion. Cui bono? Who benefits from more territory? The shareholders. So the shareholders pushed for more wars, more conquest, more territory. And the company, using armies paid for by shareholder capital, delivered. By 1750, the East India Company was the single largest military and political force in Asia. It had more soldiers than the British Crown. It had more ships than the British Navy. It had greater tax revenue than many European nations. It was a company that had become an empire. Or more precisely, a company that was now also a state. Double leveraged power. But here is the problem that emerged. If the company was that powerful, if it controlled that much territory, why did it still need to answer to the British Crown at all? Why did it not just declare independence and become its own nation-state? Answer: because of the money machine in London. The Crown controlled the Bank of England. The Bank of England controlled all capital flows. The company, no matter how powerful militarily, could not function without access to British financial markets. To pay its soldiers, it needed to exchange its goods for British currency. To do that, it needed the Bank of England to keep valuing that currency. To reinvest profits, it needed British financial markets. To borrow for new campaigns, it needed the bank. In other words, the Crown had financial control even if the company had military dominance. And since the Crown had delegated military operations to the company, the Crown had essentially achieved dominance without responsibility. The company did the fighting and dying. The Crown kept the financial power. The shareholders got the profits. And the people of India paid everything. But Britain was only one nation. One empire in progress. How do you scale this system? How do you make it work globally? How do you make sure that every nation on Earth has to use British currency, trade through British merchants, and ultimately bows to British financial power? That required something else. That required Britain to become so essential to global commerce that there was literally no way for other nations to avoid dealing with it. Chapter 2: The Industrial Revolution, a Strategic Choice. The Industrial Revolution. That is the phrase you learn in school. It is a phrase that hides what actually happened. Because the Industrial Revolution was not an accident. It was not a natural progression of technology and innovation. It was a strategic choice. Britain, in the 1760s and 1770s, made a decision. The decision was, we will become so efficient at manufacturing, at producing goods, at generating surplus, that every other nation on Earth will have to buy from us. And to do that, we will invest everything, every penny from the Bank of England, every ounce of capital, every resource, into making our factories better than anyone else's. And it worked. By 1780, British textile mills were producing cloth so cheaply, in such volume, that Indian handlooms could not compete. By 1800, British iron production exceeded the rest of Europe combined. By 1815, British shipping companies controlled roughly 40% of global trade. Think about that figure. 40%. Not 40% of British trade. 40% of global trade. Goods moving between France and Spain? Likely on British ships. Paying British merchants. Paying British taxes. Goods moving between the Netherlands and China? British ships. The global supply chain, every major route, was controlled by Britain. Now, you might think that this would create resentment. And it did. Other nations wanted to build their own industries, their own shipping, their own competitive capacity. But here is the problem they faced. To build an industry, you need capital. To get capital, you need credit. And the only source of credit that mattered, that had reach, that could actually fund large-scale projects, was the Bank of England. Other nations had banks. But the Bank of England was the global standard. It had the deepest capital reserves, the most reliable currency backing, the most trust. So if France wanted to build a textile mill, it would need to borrow from the Bank of England, or borrow from a French bank that had borrowed from the Bank of England. Either way, the chain of financial obligation led back to London. Chapter 3: Financial Colonialism. Here is where we arrive at a concept so powerful, so comprehensive, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it in the rest of history. It is called financial colonialism. Military colonialism is simple. You conquer territory. You plant a flag. You take resources. Financial colonialism is far more elegant. You make a nation dependent on your financial system. You do not have to conquer. You do not have to plant a flag. You simply make it so that the nation's economy cannot function without access to your currency and credit. If they try to stop trading with you, their economy crashes. If they try to build competing industries, they run out of capital. If they try to go to war against you, they cannot finance it. They are conquered without a single soldier arriving on their shore. They are dominated without ever needing to occupy their territory. And the best part, from Britain's perspective, is that the conquered nation invites the conquest. Because trade is profitable. When a nation can sell goods to Britain, and through Britain, to global markets, the merchants get rich. The government collects taxes. Everyone benefits. Nobody wants to turn down that trade. And once they have accepted the trade, once their economy is structured around it, it is far too late to withdraw. They are locked in. Now, here is where the strategy gets truly vicious. Because Britain did not only make itself essential through economic dominance, it also used its naval power to enforce that dominance. In the 1750s, Britain began to systematically attack the merchant fleets of rival nations. French ships carrying goods were seized, declared prizes of war. British merchants took the cargo, the ships, and the profits. This was legal under the doctrine of prize law, which Britain controlled. Portuguese merchant fleets similarly targeted. Dutch shipping systematically attacked. By using its navy to enforce its economic dominance, Britain made sure that rivals simply could not compete on shipping. They did not have the capital to replace lost ships. They did not have the confidence that their investments would be safe. So they conceded the market. They became customers instead of competitors. Between 1750 and 1815, a period that included 7 major wars and countless smaller conflicts, Britain spent roughly £2 trillion in modern currency on military campaigns. Most of that money was borrowed from the Bank of England. Most of the wars were explicitly designed to eliminate British commercial rivals. French colonies were conquered. Spanish colonies were raided. Dutch shipping was attacked. Each war cost Britain enormous sums. But each war increased Britain's commercial share of global trade. Each war increased the value of British currency. Each war increased the profits of Bank of England shareholders. So from the perspective of the financial system, the wars were not expenses. The wars were investments. Money was paid out to fight the wars. Territory was captured. Commercial rivals were eliminated. Trade share expanded. Currency became more valuable. Bank shares rose in value. The money that was spent came back to the investors, multiplied. This is the moment where militarism and capitalism become, for the first time in history, perfectly integrated. The money machine did not just benefit from war. The money machine required war to function. Chapter 4: The Empire That Did Not Conquer. Here is a question that confuses historians. By 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had eliminated all major military rivals. France was exhausted. Spain was bankrupt. The Netherlands was occupied by France, later by Britain. The Ottoman Empire was fragmenting. Russia was vast but poor. America was young and isolated. China was wealthy but utterly uninterested in engaging with the West. In other words, Britain had achieved something never before accomplished in human history. Naval supremacy that was not challenged. Commercial dominance that was virtually unopposed. Industrial capacity that dwarfed every competitor. Britain could have conquered the world. It had the military capacity, the financial resources, the industrial base, the naval supremacy. And yet, Britain did not conquer the world. It left most of the world's territorial governments in place. China remained independent. The Ottoman Empire remained independent, though weakening. The Indian subcontinent had numerous princes and sultans who nominally retained power, even though the East India Company was the actual governing force. Why? Because Britain had figured out that actual conquest, actually occupying and governing territory, is expensive. It requires soldiers, bureaucrats, infrastructure, all costs. But if you can make other nations' governments act on your behalf, if you can make them choose to trade with you, choose to accept your currency, choose to enforce the rules of your economic system, then you do not need to occupy them. You do not need to station soldiers. You do not need administrators. The local government does the work for you. You extract the wealth and avoid the expense. This is the genius of the British system. It is not the Mongol Empire, where you conquer and directly rule. It is not the Ottoman Empire, where you have governors and garrisons everywhere. It is something new. An empire that is not visibly an empire. An empire of financial obligation rather than territorial control. Consider the Chinese example. Britain, by 1850, wanted to make China trade with them. But China had closed its markets. China had no interest in British goods. China was wealthy, stable, and saw no reason to open its ports to foreign merchants. So Britain went to war. The Opium Wars, they are called. But Britain was not fighting to conquer China. Britain was fighting to force China to accept the terms of trade that Britain set. The war was brief. Britain had superior firepower. China's military was not designed to fight long-range naval warfare. China lost. In the peace treaty, China agreed to open 5 ports to British trade, cede Hong Kong to Britain, pay a war indemnity, and most importantly, accept that British merchants could trade opium into China, and China would not be able to restrict it. Britain did not occupy China. Britain did not plant a flag in Beijing. Britain did not station permanent garrisons. But Britain had changed the terms of trade. And once China had agreed to those terms, China had effectively surrendered its economic sovereignty. Because from that moment on, China's government could not control what was imported into its own territory. Chinese society, despite the government's wishes, became flooded with opium. Addiction skyrocketed. The social fabric tore. The government lost tax revenue and social stability. And all of this happened without Britain needing to occupy the country. Britain achieved dominance by making China's own government unable to govern its own trade. This is financial colonialism in its pure form. not conquest. Obligation, not occupation. Dependency. Now, you might ask, but what about the places Britain did actually occupy? India, Kenya, Australia, Canada, these were occupied territories with British governors and British settlers. And this is true. Britain did create a territorial empire, but the territorial empire served a purpose beyond itself. The territorial empire generated wealth through taxes, through resources extracted, through trade monopolies that flowed back to London, back to the Bank of England, back to the investors. And the investors used that wealth to reinvest in the financial system that enabled the dominance over the independent nations. In other words, the territorial empire subsidized the financial empire. The colonial territories paid for the system that kept the non-colonial world dependent. And the non-colonial world, in exchange for financial dependency, became colonial, economically, if not administratively. Everyone paid. Everyone was conquered, just in different ways. Chapter 5: The Math of Empire. Let's do the math. This is what we need to understand, because the math is what made the system inevitable. Britain, in 1800, had a population of roughly 11 million people. France had roughly 26 million. Russia had roughly 38 million. Spain had roughly 10 million. The Ottoman Empire had roughly 40 million. So Britain was not the most populous nation. Not even close. But Britain had something else. Capital. The Bank of England, by 1800, had more liquid capital reserves than all European banks combined. This is not opinion. This is documented fact. And with that capital, Britain could do things no other nation could do. Example 1: military loans. If Britain needed to fight a war, the Bank of England would lend the Crown money at favorable rates. Britain could fight expensive wars knowing it could borrow against future tax revenue. If France wanted to fight a war of equal scale, France had to either have the capital on hand or borrow from other banks, potentially including British banks. Which meant, even if France won the war, France would end up owing Britain money. Who benefits? Britain. Example 2: industrial competition. If a British manufacturer wanted to expand a textile mill, he could borrow capital from a British bank at favorable rates. The rates were favorable because the bank knew the British government would guarantee the debt if it defaulted. If a French manufacturer wanted to expand, he faced higher interest rates because French banks had less capital, which meant the French manufacturer could expand slower or less ambitiously. Over time, the British manufacturer would have more modern equipment, larger scale, lower per unit production costs. The French manufacturer would be gradually crushed. This was not due to superior French innovation. This was due to superior British finance. Capital creates competitive advantage. Example 3: colonial dominance. If Britain wanted to expand the East India Company's territory, the bank would finance military campaigns. The company would conquer new territory. The territory would be taxed. The taxes would pay back the loans with interest. British investors would profit. Indian resistance would be crushed by soldiers paid with British capital. Other nations could not do the same because they did not have equivalent access to capital. France could not finance colonial expansion on the same scale as Britain because French banks could not generate equivalent surpluses. Spain's colonial empire was being looted and was generating deficit, not surplus. Only Britain had a financial system sophisticated and well capitalized enough to finance global dominance as a profitable enterprise. Now, here is where it gets truly elegant. Because all of these advantages, military loans, industrial competition, colonial dominance, they all created a feedback loop. Every successful campaign made Britain richer. Every additional colony generated more tax revenue. Every industrial victory generated more exports. More exports generated more currency demand. More currency demand made the Bank of England's currency more valuable. More valuable currency made Britain's future tax revenues, and thus the bank's reserves, more valuable. More valuable reserves meant the bank could issue more currency and more loans. More currency and loans meant Britain could finance more campaigns, more industrial expansion, more colonial growth. The system fed itself. And the longer it ran, the more powerful it became. By 1850, 50 years into this feedback loop, Britain's share of global manufacturing was roughly 40%. 40% of the world's manufactured goods came from Britain. Not because Britain was more populated, it had only 14% of the world's population. 40% of manufactured goods from 14% of the population. That is the power of integrated financial and industrial systems. That is what happens when you couple access to cheap capital with industrial efficiency with global trade networks. You become unstoppable. And here is the thing that economists still miss. This was not inevitable. This was not the result of some natural technological progression. This was the result of a system design. A system where the Bank of England had a monopoly on currency, the Crown could borrow against future taxes, the borrowed money could be invested in military conquest and industrial expansion, the conquered colonies and expanded markets would generate new taxes, those taxes made future borrowing cheaper, and cheaper borrowing accelerated the cycle. It was a closed feedback loop. You can copy that system. But to copy it, you need to have a government willing to create a private bank and give it monopoly power, have investors willing to fund military conquest, have a strong enough navy to enforce global trade rules, have some initial advantage, whether technological or resource-based, that generates surplus, and have enough political stability that investors believe in the system long-term. Most nations in 1800 had some of these. None had all. Britain had all of them. And because it had all of them, it pulled away from every rival. And the longer it pulled ahead, the harder it was for rivals to catch up. Because now Britain had such overwhelming financial dominance that any rival trying to copy the model would also have to borrow from British banks, which meant the rival would also become financially dependent on Britain. Catch 22. You cannot compete with Britain without borrowing from Britain. And if you borrow from Britain, you become dependent on Britain. And if you are dependent on Britain, you cannot compete. So what happened instead is what we see in history. Other nations did not try to build rival systems. They negotiated within the British system. They accepted the terms of trade that Britain set. They traded within the global supply chains that Britain controlled. And they got some benefit from that trade, enough that their local elites got rich enough to resist revolution. But they never accumulated sufficient wealth or capital to truly escape the system. And that, ultimately, is what made the British system so stable. It was not maintained by force alone, though force was always available. It was maintained because opting into the system was profitable for local elites, even if it was destructive for everyone else. Chapter 6: Free Trade as a Weapon. Here is a question that Britain faced by 1850. It had achieved something extraordinary: global dominance, unrivaled military power, unrivaled industrial capacity, unrivaled financial leverage. It had created an empire that was simultaneously visible, the territorial colonies and protectorates, and invisible, the financial systems that dominated independent nations. The question was, how do you maintain that dominance indefinitely? Because dominance, once achieved, is difficult to keep. Rivals eventually build capacity. Technologies are copied. Industrial methods spread. By 1850, other nations were beginning to industrialize. America was building factories. Germany was starting to develop industry. Japan was becoming aware of what industrialization could do. If these rivals could industrialize and escape the financial system that made them dependent on Britain, Britain would lose its advantage. So Britain needed a strategy to keep rivals dependent even as they developed the capacity to compete. And that strategy was free trade. This is counterintuitive, so let me explain. Free trade, on the surface, seems like it would benefit all parties equally. If Britain trades freely with France, and France trades freely with Britain, both benefit equally. But that is only true if both parties have equal competitive advantage. If Britain has 40% of global manufacturing capacity and France has 10%, free trade does not benefit equally. In free trade, the party with overwhelming competitive advantage dominates. Britain could produce textiles cheaper than anyone else. In free trade, British textiles would flood every market. Local textile makers everywhere would be crushed. Britain could produce iron cheaper than anyone else. In free trade, British iron would dominate globally. Local iron makers would close. Free trade would give Britain complete dominance over every manufacturing sector. So here is what Britain did. Starting around 1840, Britain began to advocate for global free trade. It pushed other nations to eliminate tariffs, to open their markets, to accept British goods freely. And because Britain was powerful enough, wealthy enough, militarily dominant enough, nations gradually accepted. India was forced to eliminate tariffs. British textiles flooded India. Indian textile makers, who had been producing textiles for centuries with sophisticated techniques, were destroyed. Indian textile production collapsed from roughly 25% of global textile production to near zero. The people of India who had been textile makers were now unemployed. The British industry that had destroyed the Indian industry owned the entire market. Similar patterns repeated globally. China was forced to accept free trade. British opium flooded China. Middle Eastern textile makers were crushed by British competition. Colonial territories were prevented from developing competing industries through tariff restrictions written into colonial law. Free trade was not a neutral policy. Free trade was a policy of dominance. It allowed the dominant power, Britain, to extend its dominance over rivals not through military conquest, but through economic crushing. And the beautiful thing, from Britain's perspective, is that this could be described as liberation. We are freeing trade. We are ending the barbarous restrictions of mercantilism. We are bringing civilization and commerce together. And a lot of people actually believed this. Because free trade, in theory, should be good. All parties benefit from unhindered exchange. But in practice, when one party has overwhelming competitive advantage, free trade is just asymmetric extraction. The dominant power extracts wealth from rivals under the guise of mutual benefit. And here is the final genius of the British system. It was so well constructed, so comprehensive, that it did not even require the Crown to actively govern it. The system ran itself. Investors wanted maximum profit, so they pushed for free trade. Merchants wanted maximum profit, so they pushed for free trade. The Navy enforced free trade by attacking protectionist merchants. The Bank of England enforced free trade by refusing credit to nations that did not comply. Local governments in semi-independent nations complied because their own elites were profiting from integration into the British system. And so free trade expanded, seemingly of its own accord, across the entire globe. Nobody had to give an order. Nobody had to explicitly tell India to stop making textiles. The economic incentives did the work. The system had become something that did not require conscious direction. It was self-perpetuating. It was a mechanism of empire that nobody could quite point to and say, "There. That is the empire." Because the empire was the system. And the system had become so natural, so integrated, that people started to believe it was the way things naturally work. That this was not an imposed order, but the natural order of global commerce. This is perhaps the most dangerous thing an empire can achieve. Not the power to conquer, but the power to convince people that conquest is not happening. Epilogue: the legacy nobody talks about. The British Empire as a visible, territorial empire is gone. It lasted roughly 2 centuries. From 1750 to 1950, roughly. The Indian Raj ended. The dominions left. The colonies were granted independence. The sun finally set on the British Empire. But here is what most people miss. The system did not end. The system that Britain created, the financial mechanisms, the trade structures, the currency dominance, the integrated capital markets, persists. The pound sterling is no longer the global reserve currency, but it is close. It maintains significant value and authority. British banks remain dominant global financial institutions. The City of London remains the financial centre of the world. Trade flows are still denominated in British-influenced financial instruments. And most importantly, the model, the template of using finance rather than armies, of creating dependency rather than conquest, of making other nations voluntarily surrender sovereignty in exchange for trade access, that model has been copied. The United States, after World War II, essentially copied the British system. The US dollar became the global reserve currency, replacing the pound. American banks became dominant global institutions, replacing British banks. The US Navy enforced global trade rules, continuing what the British Navy had started. Free trade was promoted, continuing British policy. Nations were integrated into networks of economic dependency, continuing British strategy. The only difference was that the method evolved. Instead of using the Bank of England as the mechanism of dominance, the modern system uses the IMF, the World Bank, international trade agreements, and the dollar system. But the underlying logic is identical. Make nations dependent on trade. Make trade denominated in your currency. Make your currency backed by your military dominance. And suddenly you have conquered the world without anyone quite noticing. So when we ask, did Britain lose power? The answer depends on how you define power. Did Britain lose territorial power? Yes. Did Britain lose military dominance? Yes. Did Britain lose the mechanism of empire? No. The mechanism is still running. It is just running under different names and different nationalities. The machinery that Britain built, the machinery of financial dominance, of trade dependency, of currency control, persists. And anyone who wants to understand why the world works the way it works, why some nations are wealthy and others are impoverished, why debt binds nations together more tightly than any military alliance, needs to understand this history. Needs to understand that we are not living in a post-imperial world. We are living in a world where the old empires have been replaced by more sophisticated versions of themselves. Versions that do not require visible conquest. Versions that operate through systems so comprehensive that they seem like the natural order rather than an imposed system. 1776. America declares independence. Britain loses a war. And yet, 1820. America is consuming British goods faster than ever. Dependent on British capital. Integrated into British trade networks. 1821. America is the dominant power in a global system that is structurally identical to the system Britain created in the 18th century. The empire changed hands. But the empire itself never ended. It just learned not to be visible.